All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hello. I was asked to remind you all to make you aware of the Nutrition Data Summit, the hackathon that is coming up. There's plenty of information here, and if you would like more, you can follow the link there. So, all right, I'll swap over. It is really my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. His name is Dr. Martin Smith. He is the George M. Woodwell Distinguished Professor of Environmental Economics in the Nichols School of the Environment at Duke University. Dr. Smith earned a PhD at the University of California, Davis, and a Bachelor of Arts at Stanford University. Dr. Smith studies the economics of the oceans and has published research on fisheries and aquaculture, ecosystem-based management, genetically modified foods, the global seafood trade, and coastal climate change adaptation. He has served on the Scientific and Statistical Committee of the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council, and as a member of the Ocean Studies Board of the U.S. National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. He has published over 100 scholarly articles, book chapters, and reviews, including works in the American Economic Review, Science, Nature, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Smith has made appearances on NPR, which I've heard, and BBC to discuss seafood issues, and received national and international awards, including the Aldo Leopold Leadership Fellowship. His research has been funded by the National Science Foundation and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. But I know Dr. Smith as Marty because he and I were office mates in graduate school a few years ago. So Marty is a wonderful person, has an amazing wife who is an outstanding scholar in her own right, and they have two great sons. Without further ado, Marty.
Thank you very much, Norbert, for the formal and informal introduction there. We know a lot about each other, but we're in an equilibrium, so, you know, can't really say anything embarrassing about me without something embarrassing about you. You know, as economists, we love to talk about equilibrium. So let's start with an old classical economist. Most of you have heard of Malthus, and most of you also know that he predicted that human population growth would outpace the ability of the land to supply food, and that this would have really dire consequences for humanity, and it was really kind of a terrifying prediction. But of course, that didn't happen. Some people still think that that could happen in the future, but it didn't happen. And one of the reasons it didn't happen is that he failed to understand the ways that concerns about scarcity would induce innovations to actually avoid those very scarcities. Now today, a cadre of what we might call neo-Malthusians studying the oceans are predicting collapses of ocean ecosystems and fisheries in such a way that they will fail in the future to provide an important food source for humanity. And yet that doesn't also seem to be quite happening. The media coverage of ocean conservation, unfortunately, really focuses on this neo-Malthusian narrative, and it fails to address the same issues that Malthus failed to address, namely the importance of innovation. And what's a little more insidious about this, of course, is that this narrative steers attention away from the ability of the oceans to provide an important food source, and in fact discourages people from using oceans to promote food security. So let's talk a little bit about some of these scary narratives in particular. One is this concept of fishing down marine food webs due to Daniel Pauly in a very famous paper in Science from about 20 years ago. The graphic kind of tells it all, which says that we're basically sequentially exploiting the top-level predators and then moving on to the stuff that they eat and then moving on to the stuff that they eat. And eventually you kind of make your way down and we're eating bait and moving on to jellyfish and plankton, he says. Pretty scary stuff, except it's not quite true. In 2010, a paper that came out in Nature showed that if you actually redo the numbers to account for one kind of minor glitch in their analysis, that tendency to be fishing down the marine food web, actually it reverses direction and we're going the other direction. Now you might ask yourself, what does this mean for a seafood product that we really think a lot about? So let's take a really iconic predator or group of predators, tunas. They're very high on the food web, and tuna is the second largest market category of seafood consumed in the United States. It's one of the most important market categories on the globe. So you might say Pauly was looking at data and saw this steep upward trend in landings of tuna, and then maybe in some period here before his paper saw that flattening out, but it didn't actually, that wasn't true. It continued to go up, that tuna landings were continuing to go up, and then you'd think, well, maybe this was a prediction about what was about to happen, but that also wasn't true, that tuna landings continued to go up. And what about the jellyfish? You'd say, well, maybe, jellyfish, people were eating more and more jellyfish, and paper was published around 1998 here, and jellyfish landings were historically close to their highs, but they haven't really gone anywhere since then. And this, again, is as a share of the tuna landings. And so obviously jellyfish are not substituting for predators in the foods that people are eating. Let's take another scary prediction, number 2. Another one that got tons and tons of media attention, and it got tons of attention because of this statement by the lead author, Boris Worm. If the long-term trend continues, all fish and seafood species are projected to collapse within my lifetime by 2048. That sounds pretty Malthusian, sounds pretty scary. We've kind of been through this before. We had this debate in the late 60s, early 70s about limits to growth. And it turned out that modeling exercise was ostensibly saying, like, things are going down, and so we take a line and we fit it through and we project it out and it intersects this axis, and we say that's where it goes to 0. That's, of course, not a meaningful way to think about the economics of these systems, but that's ostensibly what's behind this prediction that all fisheries will be collapsed by 2048. This was pointed out, comment in Science right after the paper came out, but that didn't prevent this sort of massive media coverage. And then, of course, the lead author comes back and writes, oh, well, a lot of fisheries are doing pretty well, actually, a few years later, also in Science. And then you have other things that sort of question whether this is really happening at this level of intensity or whether it's really as scary as it seems, like the fact that U.S. seafood landings reached a 17-year high in 2011. And then, of course, I can't resist. I like to give my PhD students problems to tinker with these ideas. And it turns out the way that fisheries collapse was defined could actually be consistent with fisheries that were managed totally sustainably and optimally from an economic point of view, or it could be consistent, or it could be the case that fisheries that were not managed at all, that were heavily overfished and generating no economic value and heavily degraded, could fail to meet their definition of collapse. And so, hence the problem set for my PhD students. Okay, so why do the gloom and doom predictions get it wrong? And if you look at some of the responses to Malthus back in the classical economics period, John Stuart Mill actually, I think, hit it right on the head. And that's the one whose ideas we're gonna probe and explore in modern seafood markets today. Mill argued the conduct of human creatures is more or less influenced by foresight of consequences. Population is restrained by the fear of want rather than by want itself. So in other words, people will react to things before the worst of it has happened.
So in that sense, these neo-Malthusians, they're a bit like canaries in the coal mine. They have a role to play. They sensitize us. They scare us about problems that we might need to address in a serious way. Sometimes we might need to address those with policy. Sometimes markets might address those problems on their own. But there really are just these canaries. So more specifically, when we turn to Mill's ideas, what is it about Malthus and the doom and gloomers that they get wrong? They don't understand the ways in which scarcity incentivizes innovation. When most people hear the word innovation, they think of technological innovation. And no doubt that's played and continues to play an important role in seafood meeting food security needs. But market innovation is also another component of this. So the way that products are marketed and distributed. And policy innovation is a key point. So almost all problems in the environment space we think about, in one way or another, have to involve a policy or a governance response. And of course, one of the most interesting aspects of all of this is that these innovations can really reinforce each other. They can build on one another to lead to things that we could never have anticipated when we first started worrying about the scarcities. So for today, I'm going to go through each of those types of innovation a little bit with an eye towards seafood, and then talk briefly about an example of this synergistic innovation, I'm calling it. Turn then toward specific ways of thinking about food security and how all of that has implications for food security, and then end on some sort of policy challenges and thoughts about where to go forward. Okay, so starting with technological innovation, the history of capture seafood production, many of you have probably seen this picture before. We basically started keeping global records with the FAO in 1950, and so we have this history of ramping up fisheries that really relied heavily on modern fishing technology. Not entirely, but heavily. By 1950, industrialized countries that fish had all converted to motorized vessels. So people were no longer fishing with sail as a primary means to propel themselves. And also, throughout this period, throughout the 50s and later, there were innovations in gear technologies, innovations in designs of fishing vessels, innovations in designs of fishing gear. All that made it possible to catch more of the fish that were out there. Now, this is not all good news, right? Fish are a finite resource. There are not an infinite amount of fish in the oceans. They can only reproduce so much. So with all that technology and growing demand, we saw this steep ramp up in the total supplies of catches globally. But as fish started to be overfished, and as we started to hit the absolute limits of exploiting all the stocks that were out there, with a nod to some of those doom and gloomer neo-Malthusians, because they are pointing this out, we really started leveling off in this period. Okay, so really no further growth after the mid to late 1980s in global seafood supplies coming from capture fisheries. But as you all know, during this time, world population continued to grow. So you had continued growth and a leveling off of the supply. So if we kind of turn to an Econ 1 lens, what would you expect to see? Well, you would see, starting from some equilibrium price here and quantity there, if we saw the demand continue to increase because there are more people in the world and most countries are becoming wealthier, so there's more income and more people chasing seafood, you would expect to see prices go up. And furthermore, if there's really no way that that supply of fish could expand, that supply curve might even be vertical. So that would even lead to a more significant increase in prices. But that's far from what we see. In fact, these are all turned into real prices, so they're all inflation-adjusted prices. And they're based on trade data, which are some of the best sources of data to look at global seafood markets. We can break it down by developing country imports, exports, developed country imports, exports. All of those are bouncing around, but they're ostensibly flat. So we've had this huge growth in demand and no growth in seafood supplies, and prices haven't changed. How on earth could that be? Well, innovation, technological innovation has transformed this world. Number one is the explosion of aquaculture. Aquaculture, back in 1950, it existed, but it was a nascent technology. People have been farming fish for thousands of years, but nobody was really deliberately using modern breeding techniques to domesticate seafood, fish that swim around in the oceans or swim in lakes and streams, to domesticate them and then produce them on a massive scale for human consumption. That was not happening until the 1960s. And even then, it took quite some time for the industry to take off. So why is it that prices of seafood haven't skyrocketed as demand has grown and the capture fishery supplies have leveled off? It's because the supply from aquaculture continued to grow and grow dramatically in the face of flattening supplies from the capture fishery. And the first order driver of that has been technological innovation. Innovation in feed technologies, breeding technologies. And we'll get to some more examples of that in a bit. So we turn back to our supply and demand curve here. Sure, demand has shifted out, but because of aquaculture, the supply has shifted out. So it's entirely plausible that the equilibrium price in global seafood markets has gone down, or at least has stayed about the same, kind of depending on how much you shift your supply and demand curve around. Now, this is obviously just a conceptual picture to kind of wrap your minds around what's going on in this industry. So, some people who are critical of aquaculture like to say, oh, this is a China story only. Because in the 70s, the centrally planned Chinese economy, they deliberately embarked on a program to extensify pond-based farming of grass carps as a protein source for rural poor who were undernourished. And they were wildly successful. They actually, China produced huge amounts of farmed fish to meet protein needs for a lot of individuals who had very significant protein deficits. But it's not just a China story, because when you look at China separated out, or you look at the world excluding China, you still see this dramatic takeoff in the aquaculture industry. So, I've already told you that the reason the supplies have continued to grow is technological innovation in aquaculture. But it's also important to remember policy innovation in capture fisheries. So, although things have leveled off in capture fisheries production globally, they didn't crash down. Okay? So that's still a big part of the global seafood supply, and we're going to get to that in a bit. And we've also seen dramatic market innovation in both. So both, sorry, that slide was, I think, just saying both are important. So keep that in mind. Both aquaculture and capture fisheries are important. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about what some of those technological innovations are. I already mentioned sort of breeding technologies. One of the other things that's happened has been true of globalization more broadly, right? You've seen dramatic changes in logistics. So there's trucks carrying chilled fish. There's distribution terminals at airports, air freight. All of these things have made it possible to actually get fresh seafood or frozen seafood to markets in other parts of the world, and that's helped to grow the market. Salmon is probably the biggest hot button issue in the environmental community when it comes to aquaculture. But salmon is one that those of us who study the economics love to study for a couple of reasons. One, salmon was an early mover. Salmon was domesticated in the 1960s. Very deliberately, programs in Norway and Scotland went out to the wild, sampled genetically diverse populations of wild salmon populations, and started breeding them in a deliberate way to get traits that would actually be amenable to farming. So that's one of the things that makes salmon interesting, is that that happened early on. The other thing is that Norway is a huge player, and Norway allows academics to access confidential cost data of the companies that are involved, so you can actually look under the hood more than you could if it were, say, a US company. So that's what this picture is all about here. You can see the average cost of farming salmon over this period from 1985 to around 2000 is just tumbling. It's going down, 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 and look what's happening to the price. Now, bearing in mind that this salmon is competing in the market with wild-caught salmon. Okay? But it's actually the case that this farm salmon is driving that because it's overwhelming the wild-caught salmon in the market. And so as that cost comes down, down comes the price. More access to consumers for healthy protein for salmon. And all the while, the supply is growing and growing and growing. Now, to look a little more deeply under the hood, we have to think about what are some of the big cost drivers of something like salmon. Feed is number one. Feed is very expensive. Arguably, the number one critique of the salmon farming industry from the environmental community is that you have to feed salmon edible fish in order to get a kilogram of salmon out the other end. And in earlier days, so looking at 1990, you had to feed 4.4 kilograms of other fish to the salmon in the form of fish meal and 7.2 kilogram equivalents in the form of fish oil to get a kilogram of salmon out the other end. But look what's changed since 1990. To 2013, you see a 77% reduction in the amount of fish meal that's used. Is that because the salmon industry said, oh, the environmental community is right, we should try harder to not use fish meal? No. Maybe, they might market it that way. They're reducing costs. They found it in their interest to innovate in feed. So how have they innovated in feed? They've substituted more plant-based protein in. They've started to figure out, okay, how much actual marine-based protein do the salmon need to achieve the kind of growth and the sort of flavor profile that we're looking for. And they innovated on the suspension technology so that less feed gets wasted because it sinks to the bottom of the net pens and so forth. So you've seen dramatic reductions there. Another way that people like to measure this, and this is particularly important for the environmental issues, is the forage fish dependency ratio. It's very similar to the fish meal, but here it's how much of that fish meal is actually coming from whole fish that are caught in the wild versus trimmings and tails and heads and guts and stuff that you're taking out of the food system when you're processing other fish and turning into fish meal. So in 1990, those numbers were basically the same. So like all of it was coming from the wild. Now what you're seeing, because fish meal is expensive and because those fish have markets in the human supply chain, you're seeing reductions in the forage fish dependency ratio that are bigger than the fish meal reduction. We don't have the same kind of amazing data on shrimp, but you can see from this picture, certainly with regard to the quantity of shrimp that's in the market. Apologies there, going back. The story appears to be consistent with the salmon story. Huge increases in production, dramatic increases in real prices. Right. Now this is tough on shrimp fishermen, of course, right? Because now they're competing with an ever cheaper farm shrimp product. So when you look at aquaculture as a whole, you see that in the early days when it's a nascent industry, it's not surprising that it was the fastest growing industry in food production at over 6%. When you're almost zero, it's easy to grow at a high rate, right? But when it starts to get bigger, it's still the fastest growing by far. And then as it starts to really mature as an industry in the 90s and the 2000s, it's still the fastest growing food production technology. And you can see this in aggregate prices as well, where now these are not inflation adjusted, so this is a fish price index. So it looks like it's trending up. If you inflation adjust it, it would be flat or trending down a little bit. But the important lesson here is that you see as the aquaculture industry starts to mature and really starts to occupy an increasing share of the world's global seafood consumption, the trends start to diverge. Namely, the aquaculture index stays lower and the capture fishery price index goes higher. So in other words, the aquaculture is not only removing scarcity from the global seafood system on the whole, but it's actually disproportionately removing scarcity. So there's a little bit more scarcity that's showing up in the capture fisheries, as you would expect. Let's talk briefly about policy innovation. So policy innovation is not something that people often associate with this concept. In fisheries, the most important thing that's happened really in the last 50 years is the extension of the exclusive economic zone to 200 miles. Because ostensibly what that did was it meant that countries could control access to a common pool resource in their territorial waters. And that formed the basis to innovate in the policy sphere in other ways, like setting total allowable catches to prevent overfishing and enforcing those quotas. And as we'll see in a little bit, for going further than that and putting in market-based instruments that not only could meet biological targets in sustainable ways, but could do it in ways that produce the most economic benefit possible. So extending the exclusive economic zone was a huge transformation in fisheries, but it's still a relatively recent transition. It only happened in 1976, and it created the potential for biological and economic sustainability. Okay, so I mentioned already one of the other policy innovations that we've really started to embrace more broadly, but is still very contentious, is rights-based management, or also known as catch shares. The idea is you determine how much quota there is out there based on sort of biological considerations for the fish stock, and then you divvy it up among the individual harvesters of the resource, the individual fishers who go out and catch the stuff, and allow them potentially to trade. So in essence, it's like a cap-and-trade system for fisheries, and the idea is that it's supposed to align the incentives of the individual participants of the industry with the sustainability objectives. One of the most important things that it accomplishes is that it eliminates a very damaging race to fish. A race to fish that causes ecological damage because there's bigger, more powerful boats out there in the other ways that people regulate, and that damages the ecosystem, which can undermine the long-term productivity of the system. It generates economic waste because we're steering more resources into catching fish than we actually need to do, which means those resources could be used in other parts of the economy. And of course, it induces colossal safety risk at sea. There are all kinds, the hazard rate for deaths at sea in fishing are very substantially higher than the national average in professions that you compare it to. It's one of the most dangerous professions out there. But there's now increasing evidence that by adopting catch shares, you actually remove those safety risks because people can spread out and aren't forced to fish in bad weather. Okay, so in our paper that was published in Nature last year, we looked at this question: does the adoption of this policy systematically cause the race to fish to be attenuated in some way or to reduce the race to fish? And in fact, we found evidence across all US fisheries that have adopted catch shares compared to matched controls. We found strong evidence on average of those effects. And we found a number of individual examples of fisheries where that happened. And so the important message here is the negative result means the race to fish is slowing. There are a few counterexamples, and that's something I got a chance to talk about yesterday with Sean Cash's class. But I will skip on to move to some topics in market innovation. So market innovation is the one area that Mill didn't specifically talk about when he was engaging this. But we have to step back and ask ourselves, we're thinking about the role of seafood in global markets. How are people accessing seafood? Well, one thing that's happened that's really transformative is that more and more of the seafood supply that's going to consumers is coming in supermarkets. So you have this pattern that is true in other food sectors as well, which is an ever-consolidating retail sector in supermarkets and hypermarkets is selling a growing share of the food to people. And that's true in seafood in industrialized countries. And then there's, of course, a literature also showing that that pattern in retail consolidation and purchasing food in supermarkets is applicable to urban centers in developing countries. And so this is sort of a global phenomenon. Well, sorry. How does that relate to aquaculture? You'll probably want to know. What are those consolidated retailers looking for from suppliers? They're looking for large volumes, steady volumes, consistent quality, low price. Who can deliver that? Farm fish. Farm fish can deliver that because they can control the production process. They know how much they have. They can slaughter and time it exactly the way the supermarkets are demanding it. So the market innovations in food systems more broadly are very well aligned with growth in aquaculture. To some extent, they're well aligned with policy innovations like catch shares, because one of the things that slowing the race to fish allows you to do is to time the market. So to the extent that you want to time the market and key into these trends that are happening in retail, catch shares is a way forward for that. I do want to mention that critics of farm salmon really, they don't entirely realize just how innovative this industry has been. A middle-class US consumer in the middle of the country can plan to buy fresh salmon for a dinner party at a supermarket really any day of the year. Nothing like that in seafood markets existed in the 1970s and 1980s. There was nothing that would be fresh and widely available anywhere in the country that's desirable for a dinner party. That's a huge change. Okay, so we see a number of new product forms that build on the innovation of being able to deliver consistent supplies. And some of these are just, to me, they're just unbelievable. Who could have ever imagined a product like Salma Raw, which sadly has not yet made it to the United States? It's not obvious what that picture is depicting. Salma Raw is a company that has worked on slaughter technology to chill fish in a way that you get the no rigor to set in after you slaughter, so you can remove all the pin bones and strip off the most high-quality fillet that's furthest from the bone, vacuum pack it, and get it out to market as sashimi-grade salmon the next day. So from slaughter to market the next day. That was a huge innovation, and it's very popular in Norway. But not many years later, Salma Raw started taking that and slicing it as sashimi, packaging it with sesame seeds and ponzu sauce, and selling it as a snack in 7-Eleven. Which I actually purchased that in 7-Eleven for about $10 or $12, which, considering what it is breathtakingly cheap. Okay, so we see a number of new technologies in salmon that are trying to address other impending scarcities, right? So one of the limits to continued growth of the salmon industry is space, where to put the net pens, and feed utilization. So it's still an issue. It's still a cost issue for them. So genetically modified salmon is attempting to address some of that by speeding up the production cycle and potentially growing out salmon on land rather than in fjords. Another company is kind of keying off of some of the other environmental aspects that people have expressed concern with by substituting away from fish meal and fish oil. Interestingly, Verlasso Salmon, their first cut at this, it was a joint venture between DuPont and Aquaculture, the largest Chilean salmon company. Their first cut was to use a genetically modified yeast to sub out a lot of the fish oil and fish meal in the feed. Okay. Turns out the very customers that they were most wanting to appeal to didn't like the idea that the fish were being fed genetically modified anything. And so they've kind of reformulated, and they're now working on marine algae, I believe. I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time and talk a little bit about synergistic innovations. When my co-author, Frank Osta, first showed me these data, I couldn't believe it. Because there was a part of me that thought, you know, these stories we talk about with innovation and the way incentives work, you know, that it's difficult to test these ideas, and this figure certainly isn't a formal empirical test of these ideas. But it blew my mind when I looked at these data and I realized, wow, when this fishery was regulated with open access, you saw this huge ramp up, and almost all that ramp up was going into what's called reduction. In other words, turning this potentially valuable human food source, Norwegian herring, turning it into fish meal and fish oil. But of course, that huge ramp up did lead to a substantial collapse in the fishery. And so, boom, this thing comes crashing down. And then, lo and behold, they started regulating the fishery. But how did they regulate the fishery? Did they adopt a property rights-based system? No. They adopted a total quota system, and they induced a race to fish. So by setting a total quota, eventually, they were able to start ramping production back up because they were able to recover the stocks of fish. But as they ramped production back up, some of it was going into human use, but then some of it, more and more of it, was starting to go into this industrial lower value use because of the race to fish. But then market-based regulation comes in here, and you see continued improvement in the stocks. But now you see a smaller and smaller share is going into the fish meal, fish oil market. In other words, the policy that's the policy creates an incentive to steer the product to the higher value use. It's an important innovation. Now, what does that do to the fish meal and fish oil market? Well, obviously, that's going to drive up the price of fish meal and fish oil, which creates greater incentives for the aquaculture industry to innovate to deal with that. But the other thing that it does is it creates incentives for us to use waste from processing fish and funnel that into the fish meal and fish oil markets. And that's happened too, which is one of the reasons that forage fish dependency ratio has come down. So these innovations are all kind of layering on top of each other and interacting in interesting ways. So let's talk about food security a little bit. I think I probably don't need to define this, but just so we can agree on terms a little bit, food security is a situation that exists when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Well, the thing about this definition that really is striking to me is that it creates a very high bar. Right? If we achieve all of this in food security, we are achieving a lot. But I think it's important that it's not just about the total amount of food, which sometimes people kind of focus on. So I think it's a fair question to ask, why does innovation in fisheries and aquaculture matter for wealthy countries like the US? Well, one answer to that question is sort of a rhetorical question, which is, and I said this in a meeting earlier today. If you ask, why does this company called Nokia making mobile phones in 1992, why does that, or 1995, why does that matter for the world's problems, right? Nobody would have imagined that 20 million Nigerians would have mobile phones now when people were talking about this company Nokia in the 1990s, right? So one answer to this question is simply that the leading edge technologies that are developed possibly to serve the higher value, more wealthy markets create technological changes that can actually be applicable and used to deal with food security needs in other places. But another answer is, from your dean here, this very famous paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association, that there are really dramatic health benefits that are associated with consumption of omega-3s. And this is, again, this is a hugely important paper in the seafood world. It's not necessarily the last word on this, but you see a very striking thing when you look at farmed Atlantic salmon, look at the cost to consume the recommended amount of omegas that gets you this reduced risk of cardiac death by 36%. It's a tiny, tiny amount of money. Because it's a reminder that this industry has put a very healthy protein in front of and access to a very healthy protein from a very wide swath of societies like the United States. Not just the wealthy in the United States, but lower and middle class and lower middle class people can afford farmed salmon once in a while. It's pretty dramatic. So that's an important reason. Another reason, of course, is that it's what people like to eat, and it's really driving things in the US seafood economy. When you look at per capita seafood consumption in the US, the big ones are shrimp, tuna, salmon, pollock, and tilapia. Those are the top 5. But notice what's trending upward. Shrimp, salmon, tilapia. In other words, the things that are trending upward are the things that are farmed. So people in the United States are eating more seafood than they used to, in part because of dietary recommendations and in part because of prices and income growth. And the more seafood they're eating is coming from farm sources. But I think it's fair to say, is aquaculture really just for the rich? Critics of aquaculture say yes, and they point to innovation in farmed salmon as really serving high-income markets, and they point to things like rising imports of shrimp and whitefish. Well, first of all, it's really important to remember that global seafood consumption, it is, per capita, it's correlated with income. But it's not perfectly correlated with income. There are lots of countries that are lower or mid-income, like China and Southeast Asian countries, that are very high seafood consumers. So it's not the case that innovation that produces more fish is just going to go and serve the wealthy necessarily. But in aquaculture in particular, until this paper that's just now, it's in press, it's just coming out, until this paper came out, it wasn't obvious that there actually is a majority of the seafood that's being produced in middle and lower income countries through aquaculture is actually staying domestic. And so people in places like Egypt, Brazil, Philippines, Bangladesh, Myanmar, India, China, and Indonesia really are eating most of the fish that they're farming domestically in those places. And there's been a lot of attention to the huge export-oriented industries in Vietnam and Thailand, which of course produce loads of cash income for those countries, but those countries are also the exceptions. So when you look here, you see the aquaculture exports of almost 80% for Thailand, almost 60% for Vietnam. Those are exceptions, whereas these other countries, Indonesia and so forth, the sort of dark orange brownish bar here, those are almost all domestically consumed. So yeah, there are export industries in these places, but the majority is domestically consumed. And it's particularly interesting when you look at China. China is the largest seafood exporter in the world. It's the largest seafood importer in the world. It's the largest seafood producer in the world, and it's the largest seafood consumer in the world, as on a country basis, right? But when you look at China as this unbelievably huge exporter, still, in its aquaculture industry, only less than 10% of its aquaculture is exported. Now, some of that's because of this historical legacy of the extensive farming of grass carps for the rural Chinese population, and some of it's the growing middle class consuming more and more of that farmed stuff that's competing directly with what US consumers are eating. Okay, so some policy challenges kind of to finish off here. A lot of the environmental community likes to paint either or contrasts and sort of suggest somehow that capture fisheries are good and farm fish is bad. Small scale, artisanal is good, large, bad. You kind of get the point, right? And I think that these are really false dichotomies. The idea that somehow this whole category of large or small or whatever would be good or bad, that's a lot of how the narrative unfolds in the media, and it's a lot of how the environmental community addresses these things and goes after particular industries. But if we're thinking about the challenges of food security for the future and what's at stake, we're really going to need to produce a lot more food from the oceans and get it to a lot more people in different places, meaning a lot of different types of dietary needs. And that means we have to embrace complementarity across these different things as the reality and not simply prioritize one over the other. So we don't want to just turn our backs on overfishing and let that big chunk of global seafood supplies, which currently is roughly half of human consumption of seafood, we don't want that to go tumbling down. And if we can improve a little bit, that's great. Okay. But at the same time, we don't want to turn our backs on innovation in aquaculture, which is where all that future growth is going to come from. So it's another way of saying, thinking about this canary in the coal mine, we definitely want to listen to the bird, because we don't want to ignore pending scarcities or possible crises that are associated with our ecological damages to the oceans and what may or may not be sustainable. But we definitely don't want to take the bird's policy advice. And we need to think carefully about how we formulate policies that incentivize innovation and innovations that really address the needs of society and aren't just knee-jerk reactions to all of that. Now, in the last, I wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions. How am I doing? Is that clock right there? We started a couple minutes late, or
But we have to be done by 1:15.
we need to be done by 1:15. I'm going to skip over what keeps me up at night. Well, I'll say it quickly. What keeps me up at night is this kind of challenging situation where the countries that are most positioned to govern their resources effectively are the very same, are wealthier countries. And the wealthier countries are the ones that are not experiencing undernourishment. So these these trade flows from developing countries that are not necessarily in a position to govern their resources effectively are worrisome. And that's what I would call a trade governance dilemma. So it's generating foreign exchange, but it may be at the expense of the long-term sustainability. The other thing that really is one that we need to address is disease in aquaculture. So we had this major crisis in Chile with a collapse associated with an outbreak of infectious salmon anemia. There have been governance reforms to address that, so an innovation in the policy space. But now the big problem globally in the salmon industry is sea lice, which reduce the productivity of the fish and also can contaminate wild populations. So there's a lot more to do, and I don't want to leave you with the picture that markets and the economics and everything solves all the problems that are out there. But if we think about things that are really going to stress future growth in aquaculture, which is likely to be the thing from which future food supplies are going to continue to grow from, we're going to have to address disease problems in a much more serious way. And I had a bunch of ways of talking about that. But I'll just stop there and leave you with some of the good news as my last slide and take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. We have about 10 minutes for questions, and I'll let you field questions as you like.
Great. Yeah.
Innovations in aquaculture right now will center around monocultural approach, for instance, to what extent do you think multi-trophic approaches to aquaculture may be innovations in the future?
I think if there are multi-trophic approaches that can deal with the reality of modern seafood markets, that might be the biggest hurdle. I mean, I definitely understand that there's a lot of interest in this because of the environmental benefits of it, the ability to do it extensively and not necessarily as intensively. But at the end of the day, if you're going to serve a significant chunk of global seafood markets, you're going to need to find ways of producing large volumes of steady supplies. And so if that can happen in those systems, then it will be important. Yeah?
I'm curious if there's data you know of that tracks whether or not this shift from sort of fish meal towards more plant-based feed has altered the nutritional composition of the
Yeah, and it's not exactly my area, but I've tried to track that a little bit, and the answer seems to be yeah, a little bit, but not quite as much as you might think. So I actually, I teach a class called Should I Eat Fish? And I had my students go out and buy farmed and wild-caught salmon from several different stores, and then we brought them into my colleague Heather Stapleton's lab. She's a toxicologist, and we tried to replicate a bit of analysis that was in a very kind of high profile, but a bit on the doom and gloom side, paper in Science by a toxicologist named Ronald Heitz, and looking at PCB concentrations in the farm versus wild. And of course, we didn't have the power to really, in the small samples that we had, to really, publish a paper and get to the bottom of this. But we saw some indications that the substitution that's taken place since that paper is published to more plant-based diets has actually reduced the PCB concentrations in the farmed. And that's sort of consistent with what our hypothesis was. Of course, those PCB concentrations are very, very far below actionable levels anyway. But yeah, so it's entirely plausible, and there's been some study of that. You had a question here? Yeah.
Yeah, I was curious if there seems to be an issue on the definition of sustainability. So the Whole Foods and Monterey are saying, measuring it one way, but then you have others who are really looking at the role of fishermen in the process and saying that the way we need to deal with this is to expand the number of species, let fishermen catch, and keep them involved as well. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, that's a long conversation. So, but I'll just say, just as an anecdote, I often tell people, I just don't see how you could call a fish sustainable if it's not profitable. Like if it doesn't actually generate like profit, and you're wasting the resource in some sense. So none of the indicators that are out there really care about that. And that's, the indicators are driven by a natural science conservation-oriented metric, and then that, sometimes at a later stage there's some nod that maybe humans matter and we should consider them a little bit. Yeah.
So in food first, beyond the scarcity, Frances Moreau Pay and her food sovereignty people argue that the real issue is who controls the food system.
Yeah.
And you haven't really given us a good idea of what this food system looks like. Can you do that in some?
Yeah. So who controls this food system? It's definitely it has elements that are like other parts of the food system in the sense that the individual people that fish. There's tons of them, and they're very widely distributed around the world. So in the sense that there are many, many farmers out there. Although the kind of consolidation of small farms that we've seen in places like the United States, that hasn't happened in fisheries. So there are some big fishery companies that own multiple boats and stuff, but that's more the exception to the rule. Now in aquaculture, you see more consolidation in the salmon business. Marine Harvest has something like 30% of global production, and they have facilities in Norway, Chile, a number of other countries. But in shrimp, it's a little more like the consolidation is somewhere else in the supply chain. So there's all these small growers that are farming, shrimp in Thailand and Indonesia, and then they're selling to a processor, and then the consolidation is happening when it gets to Thai Union, which is one of, or if not the biggest seafood company in the world that also owns Chicken of the Sea, Red Lobster, and some others. So, so it's there are similarities, but there are differences. One of the big differences is that despite the fact that some of the seafood products like shrimp and salmon and tuna really dominate U.S. consumption in terms of most of it, it's still highly differentiated. There's hundreds and hundreds of species that humans are consuming. And so that differentiation is very, very different from other food systems in terms of, especially compared to livestock, for instance. So it's hard to say whether that cuts against the corporate ownership and stuff. But to the extent the retail sector is really important, it's the same players, right? Walmart, all the big retail outlets are they're super important in seafood in the same way they're important in other parts of the food system. Yeah.
How important is shipping by air, both to trade and to the assessment of sustainability for some of these systems?
Well, it's easier to answer the latter question. So if your carbon footprint is a measure of your sustainability, air freight is obviously not good. It doesn't do very well. There are, it's not a significant share of the total global seafood trade that's shipped by air in terms of volume, but it is a significant portion of the high value stuff. And some of that's live trade. So a lot of the high value stuff is shipping spiny lobsters from Mexico that are still living into the Chinese market or something like that. Yeah, I mean, I always tell people, I'm working on seafood and fisheries and so forth. The solution to that problem is to price carbon. We have to have a binding international agreement on climate change and have a price of carbon that's reflected in all of that, and then that problem is ostensibly solved. If it's worth it to ship by air and you've priced carbon, then you don't have that externality anymore. I think focusing on that issue in individual sectors is just, there's so many moving parts that I just don't think it's all that helpful. It's interesting, but it's not where I would go. Question in the back, yeah.
Moving forward, I was wondering if you thought that stock uncertainty is going to be something you don't worry about much anymore. It's going to continue to be a major challenge to managing resources. We discussed briefly yesterday that in 2012, the cod fishery here, we had major downward revisions to stock estimates, particularly political issue. Is the day of that kind of ending? Are we getting better, or is that still going to be a major challenge?
No, I think that, so yes and no. Like, that issue that you're raising of stock uncertainty and the political battles about setting quotas, that's not going to go away. It continues to be a huge challenge, and when you layer climate change on top of everything, that just amplifies the difficulty in understanding what's going on with stocks, because the environments are changing more rapidly. But when you kind of step back from like what's occupying a greater and greater share of the seafood system, that's going to be aquaculture, and that is subject to those kinds of issues. And so as a contributor to the global seafood system, that stock uncertainty is going to become a little less important. And one might argue it's already a little less important from a seafood markets perspective, because all this stuff is bouncing around globally and everything, but the markets are far more integrated, right? So unless there are real reasons that stock changes are spatially correlated, then it's not as much of an issue. So climate and El Niños and things like that can induce those sorts of correlations, but yeah.
Well, let's thank Marty for an interesting presentation.
Thank you.
For the students who are for joining Marty for lunch. It's going to be in room 133, and wish you a good rest of the day.